It is a strange kind of loneliness to exist in a world that insists you are someone you are not. To move through life carrying a name, an identity, a version of yourself that was never truly yours, yet is the only one others seem willing to see. You play the part they've assigned you, all while something deeper, truer, presses against the walls of your skin. Even when you choose to live aligned with your authenticity, there is risk. The fear of being exposed becomes its own kind of prison, shaping every step, every breath, every single choice. Fear lingers in every meaningful moment, every swallowed word, and every ache of invisibility of your true self. Wondering, hoping that maybe one day the real you will be enough. Welcome to If These Trees Could Talk.
We would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have cared for this land for tens of thousands of years. Their connection to country ensures that we can continue to appreciate its beauty and significance today. We honour the wisdom and stories shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait people and recognise the responsibility to preserve and celebrate this legacy. This podcast is recorded on Wonnarua land, and we extend our respect to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge the lands you are listening from today, and we would especially like to acknowledge the Camaragal clan of the Eora Nation where today's story takes place. Finally, we express our gratitude to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people listening today. Thank you for continuing to share your culture, your knowledge, and your connection to this land.
Where in their life did they have their needs met? It's a bad call. It's a bad call. Josephine said to her, "What do you mean, my father? That's actually my mother." She was very satisfied in the bedroom. Oh my God, what has he been using? This is the second part to the story of Eugenia Falleni and her life. If you haven't listened to part one, I'm going to suggest you jump back and listen to that one first before you head forward, because number one, this isn't going to make any sense whatsoever. And number two, it's really worth hearing about the start of her life before you head into the end of it.
So the last that we heard was that Harry and Annie are married, living with little Harry.
Yes.
And everything's going well.
It is, yes. Except for it doesn't stay that way. Sorry. Annie had some money saved up and they used that to buy her a confectionery store in Balmain. They lived above the shop. That was the place where their marital home was. And it wasn't long before Harry finished up with Dr. Clark and came across to help Annie in the store. And at the time, it was doing relatively well. But happy families didn't last for very long. It wasn't long after that Josephine came back and made contact with her dad. Her granny had died, and she was now without care or means to support herself.
How old was she?
1913, let me go back. 15. Harry had obviously not told Annie about his daughter or had given her any indication that he had had a previous relationship.
Did she see his body?
No. He used the implement with Annie, and she did have some concerns, but she kind of put it down to modesty. So Harry would always bind his chest with bandages and wear, those singlets of the time over the top. So she wasn't aware that his chest was bound. He never, ever allowed her to see him naked. And she did think that this was a little bit odd compared to her previous relationship, but she kind of just put it down to the fact that he was modest, which was also something that was very normal of the time. Modesty was something that was valued exceptionally highly. And had she had not had a previous relationship, it's very likely that she just would have assumed that that was normal. There were a couple of other little things along the way. She found a menstrual pad once in a bin at the house and questioned him about it because it definitely wasn't her time of the month. And she questioned him about it, and he said he'd been injured at work and they had used it to help curb the blood flow, and he'd worn it home because there was still minimal bleeding and placed it in the bin at home. And she said, "Why didn't you ever tell me that you were injured?" And he was like, "Oh, no, it's okay. It was fine. And I didn't want to worry you." And she also thought, oh, with his modesty, you know, if it was in an area that he didn't really want to show me, then perhaps that might have had something to do with it. So she was very good at making excuses for the questions that she had, as well as Harry being able to give plausible explanations for the things that she questioned. And outside of all of that, she was very satisfied in the bedroom. She thought he was a great husband and lover. Harry kept his dildo. We're just going to call it a dildo. I think at the time they called it an appendage, but he kept it in a bag in a little portmanteau beside the bed, buried under his posh clothes that he didn't get out very often. And he knew if he was going to have marital relations with her, and his routine was that he would go into the bathroom, put it on. He would always wear his singlet. He'd pull up his underwear over the top of it. He would hop into bed. The doona would go back up over the top, and then sex would occur. And she was none the wiser, quite happy, quite content, a little bit questionable about the fact that they never changed positions. I think that was a concern, but it wasn't enough to make her go, this isn't a satisfying relationship, because it was a very satisfying relationship. And I don't think that any real trouble occurred between them. They were very, very happily married, and people talked about them heading off shopping arm in arm, and they seemed to have a really, really lovely time together up until the time that Josephine came back. Harry had not mentioned to his wife that he had a child or that he'd even had a previous relationship. So Harry and Josephine spoke, and Josephine promised to keep his secret, because during her time while she lived with Granny, Granny had explained to Josephine that the man who insisted she call him father was actually her mother. Mrs. DeAngelis and Josephine were really the only two people in Sydney who knew about Harry's past lives and his experiences. So when Josephine said, "I'm happy to keep the secret, I will refer to you as my dad," he brought Josephine to the home and explained to Annie that her mother had died, and he was sorry that he hadn't told her about this before, but he was not allowed to have contact with the child, and he didn't ever think that he would ever see her again. Annie obviously accepted this, given the fact that she had a child, Harry, who older Harry was helping to raise, and that was okay for a little while until Josephine started living her teenage life, and she was going out and she was doing things. And Harry had tried to be quite a good dad to little Harry and was quite strict and expected him to help out around the house and do lots of things. And I think Annie at times was like, oh, you might be a little bit too hard on him. But once Josephine arrived and she was heading out and she was hanging out with men who were unbeknownst to her parents, I think that's how they used to refer to it back then, and sort of not coming home till early hours of the morning or staying out all night, it caused some real issues because Harry didn't seem to care about that. He only cared what little Harry did. And Annie, it caused some problems for her. So she would put pressure on Harry, and Harry therefore would put pressure on Josephine, and then it was just row after row after row, and things weren't going great for the Crawford family at that stage. One of the neighbours noticed that Josephine had been spending quite a lot of time there and had asked lots of questions, noticing the change in the behaviour of the couple living next door. And Josephine said to her, "What do you mean, my father? That's actually my mother." And it was a bit of a stab because she was angry at her dad, but she panicked straight away and went home and kind of put it down to thinking, no, it'll be okay. She won't take that seriously. She'll realise I was upset. And for a very long time, nothing happened. And she thought that that was fine. However, the neighbour wrestled with this and wondered, do I tell Annie? Is it true? Is it not true? Is this something that I should meddle in?
Nah.
Well, unfortunately, it was something she decided to meddle in. And one day when Harry was at work and all of the kids were out, I think Josephine might have moved on by this stage. She went to Annie, and I think it was early 1917. So they'd been married for about 4 years, 3 years maybe.
I just can't fathom that in that amount of time.
She didn't realise.
She didn't know.
Yeah. So the neighbour pops over while no one's home and says to Annie, your daughter told me that your husband is actually a woman. And Annie was quite shocked and taken aback. And she's like, no. She'd been having sex with him for that many years. And she's like, don't be ridiculous. That's so stupid. And she was like, oh, okay. Yeah, she might have just been cranky. And then the neighbour went back home. But then Annie started thinking. And she was like, the menstrual pad. He doesn't let me touch him down there. Everything gets done in the dark. It's always under the doona. Why does he go to the bathroom immediately before and after sex? Oh my God. What has he been using to make me think that he is a man? And that, while I'm doing a lot of stuff to make us understand how difficult things were for Harry, we have to acknowledge that betrayal of Annie and how serious that sexual deception was, especially in that day.
Mm-hmm.
It's massive, and the distress that it would have caused her and the shame of not knowing what he was using and what was bringing her joy and satisfaction.
And being lied to for the entire time.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Mm.
It 100% it would cause issues. 100%. So Annie confronts Harry with this information after taking some time to process it, putting things together. And Harry, of course, denies it. Don't be ridiculous. She asks him to show her his body. He refuses. He says that she's making wild claims about him and that he shouldn't have to expose himself to a woman to prove his masculinity, which flew for a little while, but it didn't last for long. Harry was filled with a level of distress at the thought of losing his wife. And the conversations went back and forward. And I think he realised, without ever actually admitting it to her, that she knew who he was and what he'd done and that he'd deceived her. And he was quite intent on leaving Harry. And she did go for a visit to her sister, who she was a little bit estranged from at the time because the sister had never liked Harry. And she went to the sister, and Harry was aware that she was likely going to tell the sister and ask for help. So he went along, and he didn't give them very much opportunity for them to spend any time together. But the girls did go off to the bathroom, and she said to her sister, Harry is not the man that you think he is. Or something to that effect. Harry is not a man. It was something along those lines. You'll have to read the book to find out the exact wording. And the sister kind of took it like, oh, is he maybe homosexual? Like, is he sleeping with men behind her back? Because it was only seconds after the words come out of Annie's mouth that Harry knocked on the door to check if they were okay. not giving them an opportunity to actually have a full conversation together. So Harry and Annie went on their way, and her sister was kind of left to ponder this. She'd never been a huge fan of Harry, so she was kind of like, oh, maybe she's just saying like that he's not a real man, like maybe he's not satisfying her in the bedroom. There could be a whole heap of things that could allude to. So she just kind of sat with that, and their relationship had been estranged. They hadn't spent a lot of time together. So when she didn't hear from Annie in the following weeks, it was no real surprise to her. However, Annie had made the decision that she was going to leave him. She just needed to figure out how she was going to do it. So she spent time planning and thinking through some possibilities, because she didn't hate Harry. She had respect for him, and their relationship was good, and she understood that his affliction, which they would have referred to it at the time, was not in fact his fault. She came up with the idea that she was going to put to him that they would file for divorce, that she would keep his secret. The reason for filing for divorce would be that they had never consummated the marriage, which she said was true. And yes, in the normal sense of husband and wife, they had not consummated their marriage. So she didn't feel like she was lying to the law to have the marriage annulled. And when they asked for the reason behind that, she would explain that on the night that they got married, Harry told her that he had a daughter, and she was so angry with him for withholding that information from her that their relationship had never been the same, and they had never actually slept with each other. And she thought that that was a really great way to preserve her image in society, because if it was to be found out that she had been in a relationship with a woman, she would be shunned from society. Harry would be crucified because he had been parading, and sexual deception was a very serious crime in those days, punishable by law. And she didn't want Harry to go to jail. She didn't want him to be punished. She just wanted to be able to move on with her life and take her son and move forward. And I think that was very kind of her. However, Harry was hoping, because since she'd found out, they'd still been living alongside each other and it had been quite cordial. And while Annie wasn't sleeping in his bed, they had coexisted in really a quite nice and lovely way. So he was sort of holding out hope that maybe she could accept him for who he was in his true self. And maybe this is the first time that he might be able to have a relationship with someone who knew the real him and the true him despite his shortcomings. So they went off on their picnic, which Harry had organised, to the place where he had first told her that he loved her, him with the hope that they were going to reconcile, and her with the decision that she was going to tell him that she wanted their marriage dissolved. Now, we're never really going to know what happens here, because right until Harry's death, he insisted that he was not guilty of murdering Annie. The author, Mark Tedeschi, in the book has his own ideas based on some things that Harry told the police during that time where he was under coercion, and some research that he's done. And he's accused that he's quite good at the research. So his perception is that a quarrel broke out, Annie tried to leave, Harry grabbed her, she fell backwards, hit her head on a rock, and Harry believed she was dead. Because of this, he panicked. They'd caught a ferry to this picnic ground. There was no one around where he could go and get help. So once Harry believed that she had died, he hugged her and kissed her, and he was just so desperate he didn't know what to do. He started running back towards the mill that was just down the river from where they were picnicking, But as he got there, he looked at his clothes and his hands and he was covered in blood. And he was like, if I turn up here, they're going to think that I did this. So he raced back to Annie, and to him, it was clear that she was not breathing. She had passed away, but he needed to catch a ferry back to their home. And he's like, what do I do with her? I can't just leave her here. The animals will eat her. So he decided that he had to bury the body. He tried to do that. He didn't have a shovel stashed away in his picnic basket. It's a pretty good indication that this wasn't a premeditated thing. He didn't think she's going to expose me, so I'm going to kill her. He tried to dig a grave with a stick, and when he realised that wasn't going to work, the next best option was burning her body. So he made a makeshift fire and slowly moved her body through the flames so she would be burnt to a state where she was not recognisable. That way he would tell people that they had separated and she had gone off and he was now on his own. That seemed like a very plausible option for him, because the opposite of that was that he had been living his life as a man, and if he was charged with her murder, he would then have to live his life in a male prison, which would have immediately brought back the trauma of his life on that ship. I can't pretend to understand the rationale of him in that moment. I don't know that I could ever just burn a body
Of the person that you love.
of the person that you love, no matter what the consequences. I can't rationalize that, but I'm trying to do it in a different time, in a different space.
Why wouldn't he just explain it was an accident?
Well, that's Gregory Lynn. Don't touch the evidence. Go and get help. The evidence is going to show that's what happened. If she's laying with her head on top of a rock and there's a pool of blood behind it, there's no other marks of violence on her, it's going to support your series of events. But I think when you've been living a life of deception, it's a bad call. It's a bad call. You look like you want to say something, but you're not.
But Gregory Lynn did it because he really was covering up a crime.
That's right, 100%, yes. But why wouldn't Harry go, I'm going to go to the mill down the road and I'm going to get some help and I'm going to tell them what's happened, and then he's going to have witnesses. Yeah, it's a tough one. And we don't really know even that that's what's happened. I'm just giving you the author's opinion.
Timmy's going to hate this one. You keep telling stories and he thinks we're going to get to the end and have an answer of actually what happened. And here we are again.
No. But how the story ends has its own ending. So
we're still going.
Whoa. So Harry then went on and lived his life. He panicked for weeks after he contemplated suicide.
Where was little Harry?
So at the time that Annie and him went on the picnic, little Harry was away for work.
Oh,
and he came
big
back.
Harry now.
Yeah, well, he's in his teens. But like people went to work when they were 12 back in those days. So he'd gone away for work. He came back and said to his stepfather, where's Mum? And he said, she's gone away with some friends. We had a bit of a fight and she's gone to stay with a friend. And he was like, okay, that's righto. And he went off to bed, realised that his stepdad was sitting at the table drinking whiskey, and he got up the next morning and almost all of the whiskey was gone. And Harry suggested that perhaps maybe he doesn't go to work that day and maybe they do something. And Harry took little Harry to the Gap in Sydney, the place that is very well known for suicides. Harry climbed over the fence and started throwing rocks into the sea and tried to convince little Harry to climb over the fence with him. Little Harry refused. He realised this was a little bit strange. And he was like, no, I'm not getting over that fence. So once Harry realised that he wasn't going to be able to coax the boy over the fence and grab hold of his hand and both of them leap off the gap to their death, I think he might have been a little bit relieved that that's not how this story was going to end. No, it didn't end in a suicide, but I think that's what he wanted in his desperation at that point. They went back, they sold up all the furniture in the house. Big Harry and Little Harry moved into a boarding house, and Little Harry really didn't ask too many questions about his mum or why she hadn't come back. So after a little while, Harry felt a bit encumbered by having to take care of this young boy. So he dropped him off at a boarding house and he went off and lived his life. He got married to another woman who also loved him and thought he was great and everything was wonderful. But in 1920, the police turned up because the family that little Harry had lived with, someone in that family had told him that his stepdad was actually a woman. And that started the cogs turning in his head. So he went to his auntie, told her the story, and together, 3 years after Annie's death, they reported her as a missing person. The police put all of this together and went looking for Harry Crawford. I'm not going to go into the trial because it's massive. What I'm going to tell you is, well, it wasn't massive in the case of the time because it only lasted for 2 days. But Harry didn't have a great lawyer. The police prosecutor was great. There was a media circus in the lead up to the trial. Harry's picture was posted all through the papers. The police then got a whole heap of witnesses who were able to identify him in a lineup, but his picture had been all through the papers. There was some dodgy police work. There was a lot of coercion, and they convinced Harry to make a statement by telling him that he was going to be placed in a male prison and that they needed a confession from him to stop him doing that. He didn't confess. He said he was innocent. And so they threatened that he was going to a male prison. When that didn't twig him, they said he needed to be checked by a doctor and he refused.
Is this about Annie as a missing person, or is it about him identifying as a man when he's really born a woman?
Well, the police knew that he was a woman that was living as a man. So the police used that knowledge without telling him that they knew that about him, by threatening to send him to a male prison, by threatening to put him in front of a doctor, because they wanted that exposed. But they needed him to expose it because they couldn't make it seem like from their end that they knew anything about it. It had to be this big sensational thing because it was going to be the thing that convicted him. As soon as people in society found out that this man was actually a woman, he was going to jail regardless.
For murder?
Yeah. Because juries were very different in those days, and the rules around protecting people from photos and information that could influence a trial, they were basically non-existent. So every juror in that room had read for months newspaper articles about the man-woman who had murdered his wife. There is no way you could find an impartial jury.
I just don't see the connection between the woman identifying as a man and murder. Like, why does, just because he was born a woman, why does that mean, yes, you murdered? I can't see
because you think about the time and society, how society works. There's the people at the top who are rich and affluent, and then we go down through the working class, and then we go down through the poor people and the convicts, and then right at the bottom in Australia we had the Aboriginal people. That hierarchy existed, and the way that the people on the top keep their privilege is by making sure that the people underneath them stay squashed. So anything that is different or threatens their way of life or could possibly be against the Bible is just viewed as the worst thing possible. And Harry was all of those things. And they found the implement. And they used it in the trial. They exposed it to the jury. They showed the hundreds and hundreds of people who turned up to get a gore.
So it's a motive.
It is 100% a motive. They're like, this person is different to us and they're depraved.
But that's a reason. Like, were they saying because Harry is actually a woman, Annie has found out, so he killed her.
So he murdered her to stop her telling other people.
Okay.
A lot of criminal trials during the late 1800s and early 1900s were so based on popular opinion or what the people who were going to vote for the next, what the feeling of those people were. Our legal system is very different now. It's still based on the same adversarial system, but it is different, and we have laws to protect people and we have laws to keep juries impartial now that just didn't exist in those days. They go through the trial. If you want to know more about that, go and listen to Mark's book, because he goes into it in finite detail and lists all of the ways that how he would have fought the case and all of the ways that the people let Harry down during that trial.
Listen to or read the OG way.
Or you could read the OG way, but who reads? He was sentenced to death because he was regarded as a woman. In 1920, it had been quite a few years since a woman had been sentenced to death. So it was petitioned, and the death sentence was commuted to life in prison. Harry was taken to Long Bay Jail, where he then had to live as a female because they put him into the female prison because genetically he was female, which actually was his greatest fear. He was going to be put into a men's prison and be exposed to a life of rape and torture from men in a confined environment. So going to a female prison was actually the thing that made him be honest about his gender to the doctor while the police were questioning him. But while he was in jail, well, I should say she now, because we've moved to that point, and I think it was at this time she changed her name to Jean Falleni. She kind of really fit in well there. She was a hard worker. She did the jobs that they required. They were fed. They were safe. They allowed female relationships in the prison. There's been a lot of rhetoric recently about, the fads. Oh, transsexualism's a fad, or homosexuality's a fad, or it's a lifestyle choice. We're talking about a 1920s prison. There were lesbian relationships happening inside of that prison in the early 1900s, very likely in the late 1800s, very likely for as long as time has occurred. And it was not looked down on by the authorities in the same way as gay relationships were, and they were encouraging of it. It kept people happy, they were connected, things were good. So in the female prisons, go for it. You just have sex with whoever you like. But for the first time in Eugenia's life, she met a woman where she had a reciprocal, romantic, quite possibly sexual relationship with.
No secrets.
It took her going to prison to get there. Not everything that, in this point we'll say they, not everything that they did throughout their life was good. Can I justify it? Probably not. Not burning a body. But can I understand, especially when you're looking at the hierarchy of needs, where in their life did they have their needs met? And I'm not even talking about the top of the pyramid.
Yeah.
Their ability to be able to earn money, their ability to have connectedness and acceptance. There is nowhere in their life that they had that. And then she was in prison, and that was the first place she found it. It just blows my mind. After spending quite some time in prison, because her sentence was a life sentence, she did eventually, due to her ailing health and her age, be allowed out of the prison. She was still regarded as a prisoner, but she was allowed to live out in the community. So she lived in some boarding houses and she took a few menial jobs, but she saved up enough money to buy a little dilapidated boarding house, which she renovated and she painted and she made it really, really nice. By this stage, she was living a life as Jean Ford, because anytime she used the word Falleni, people automatically knew who she was. And she received a lot of backlash because of that. So she changed her name to Jane Ford. She built herself this little boarding house empire where she'd buy the first little one, do it up, get a few boarders, collect rent, and then she would sell that with the tenants to somebody for a profit, and then she'd buy a bigger boarding house and have more tenants and more income, and then she would sell that for a larger profit. And she did this quite a few times. So in 1838, she had sold a boarding house. She had made £100 profit from that, which she collected, and she was on her way to the bank to deposit that. It was the 9th of June, and as she stepped out to cross the road to go to the bank, she was hit by a motor vehicle on Oxford Street. She died the following day after being in a coma from the time that the car hit her. And because she had no will, the money that she'd worked so hard for just went back to the government. And that was the end of her life. But I feel really, really good that at the end of her life, even though she was living as a female, and I believe myself, this may not be right, I believe she identified as a male and she had to live as a female because that was a part of her condition of being released from prison. But she had self-respect. She'd built her life up to a place where she could provide for herself. She was looking forward to retirement and she thought that it was all going to work out fine. And it didn't. And I'm sorry. Your face. So I'm just going to remind you again that if you want a deeper dive into the life and the trial of Eugenia Falleni, I can highly recommend the book Eugenia, A True Story of Adversity, Tragedy, Crime and Courage by Mark Tedeschi. As always, I will provide links to the hard copy and the Audible version for both the listeners and the readers in the show notes. Megan has had her detective hat on and has deduced that we are heading to Q Station for her birthday surprise. Is this correct, Megan? Do you still believe that's where we're going?
Not only did I cut out an hour of drunkenness out of that last episode.
So much you cut out. I was so disappointed.
As I was editing, I thought, I'm actually going to just type these things in and see what comes up. And that's how I figured it out.
Good job.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it.
Okay, so I was going to ask you, how are you feeling?
I'm very excited. Yeah, no, I'm not scared. I'm glad that I've got what did you call?
Support person.
A support person. I'm glad a support person's coming.
Okay.
Just, the more the merrier. But I'm going to be okay. Look what you just made me sit through.
I'm sorry.
I can handle this.
Oh, God, imagine the stories we're going to get from there.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you would like to access more about the places or information included in today's topic, please visit our website ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. If you would like to follow us on our adventures, check us out on Facebook or Insta. Our creative writer is Shannon Walters and our podcast is produced at Bellevue Studio in the Hunter Valley with audio production by Megan Anderson. We love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review, and if you would like to hear more, please subscribe. We look forward to you joining us for our next adventure.